Hi friends, welcome to Timing Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use WTForms for better forms management in Flask web development. You know, in my previous video and my previous blog post, I've already talked about how to create forms and how to perform front-end and server-side form validation in Flask web applications. You can refer that video or blog post if you don't know about how to use forms in Flask. I will provide the link of that video and blog post in the description of this video. And if you don't know how to use Flask in Python, I've already got a playlist on Python Flask web development. You can go through that playlist and get to know about Flask and how to use Flask. I will leave the link of that playlist also in the description. Alright, we're talking about WTForms. WTForms is basically a Python library which can help you in managing your forms very easily in Flask web applications. As you can see in the official documentation, WTForms is basically a forms validation and rendering library for Python Flask applications. So alright, how to install WTForms? It's really simple. Go to your Python environment and just write python -m pip install WTForms. So let's go ahead and do that. I've opened my command prompt and I'm going to write python -m pip install WTForms. And now WTForms is installed in my computer. Alright, in order to demonstrate how we can use WTForms for better forms management, I'm taking a small example of a user registration form as shown in this image. And we're going to solve this problem using WTForms and Flask. So in this video, we're going to use WTForms and Flask to create a web page that handles a form something like this. Alright, let's get started with coding, and I'm going to open a blank folder and I'm going to open with VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. I'll just name it server.py, and this is going to be the Flask server. Alright, this is a really simple Flask server where I'm creating an instance of a Flask application and I'm running the app at the local host port 5000, and I'm saying debug equal to true so that I can easily debug applications in the browser. And then I've mapped a route at the home page itself where I'm rendering a template called home.html.j2. So let's go ahead and try to create the home.html.j2 template. So for that, I'm going to create a new folder and I'll just name it templates. And inside the templates folder, I'm going to create a new file. I'll just name it home.html.j2. So let's try to print hello world right now. So this is a very simple basic hello world template, and our server is going to render this template when I go to the home page. So I've got my server ready, and let's try to run this. Now I'm going to open my browser and open localhost 5000, and here you can see our server is running and it's displaying the template hello world from Flask template which we have written in our home.html.j2. So our server setup is ready. Alright, so now let's go ahead and create a form. So while using WTForms, you have to define your form fields as attributes of a form object. So let's try to create a form object now. For that, you have to import the form class from the WTForms library. So I'm going to write from WTForms import form. So now let's create our form class, which is a user registration form. So I'm going to write class user registration form, and this is going to inherit the form class which you imported from the WTForms library. So basically this class is now inherited from the WTForms form class. Alright, let's try to define some form fields. So in the user registration form, I have to take the username, right? So I'll just write a field in this form called uname, which is a username. So now I have to define what is the type of this form field. So here I'm going to write the string field, and this string field will be imported from WTForms. So I'm defining the username as a string field now. The first argument can be the label of the form input, so I can write name, and while the form is submitted, I want to make sure that the username field is not empty. So for that, I can give another attribute called validators, and in this validators list, I'm going to mention that this input is required. So for that, I'll import something called validators from WTForms, and in this list create a entry called validators.input required, and now this specifies that this username form field is required, and WTForms will run this validator while processing the form inputs. I can even mention some other validators. So if I want this input field to be at least 4 characters long and maximum 200 characters long, I can write validators.length, and in this length I'm going to write min equal to 4 and max equal to. So if I want my input not to be more than 150 characters, I can write validators.length max 150, and if I want it minimum 4 characters, I have to write min equal to 4. So I have enforced two validators on this form field, which is the required thing. That means you can't leave this field empty. And another validator is the length validator, which will specify that it needs to be at least minimum 4 characters long and maximum 150 characters long. Alright, I've got one form field set up. So let's try to display a form using this one form field. But in order to display this user registration form, you have to create an object out of it, right? So I'll just instantiate an user in the registration form here in this home page. So I'll write form equal to user registration form, and here I'm going to give the input of the request.form. So this request is actually imported from Flask. So what I'm doing here is that I'm instantiating a user registration form object, and I'm giving the request.form as an input to that, so that I can get the user input and supply it to the form while initialization. Now I'm going to pass this form object to the template as a named input here. So I'm just going to write form equal to form. So now I've injected the form object into my template. So let's try to render this form object in my home.html.j2 template. So first I'm going to create a form tag, and I'm going to say that the method equal to post, because once the submit button is clicked, it has to go to the post handler. And then I'm going to render the form as a table, because the objects can be easily aligned in the table columns. So I'm going to create a table object here. I'm going to create a single row for showing the user input, and I'm going to have two columns, one for the label and one for the input itself. So here I have to give the label of the username form field. So instead of writing the name hard-coded, I can write form.uname.label, and I can render this as a jinja value. And here, instead of writing the HTML input tag, I can just write form.uname and just call it. By calling this uname attribute on this form object, the HTML will be rendered here. So let's try to save this now, and let's try to save this server.py, and let's try to run this server.py now. Let's try to reload our output, and here you can see the label name is printed, but actually I have just written form.uname.label. So the form field label is coming from the server side, and I did not write any HTML input tag, but I've written form.uname and just called it. So Flask knows how to create an input field for a string field. So let's try to see the source code of this rendered HTML. So I'll just right click and say view page source, and here you can see I got my label rendered in place of this form.uname.label. And here I've got my input HTML tag rendered along with the front end validation also. You can see I got required here mentioned, because in my form object I told that validators.input required, and all the HTML tags like ID, name, which are all obvious, are all rendered by WTForms for us for free. So we don't need to manage all the small things like rendering the HTML, because WTForms will do that for us, and it's really handy. Alright, now comes the question of customization. So what if I want to add a HTML attribute called class equal to input to this rendered input? So how can I do that if I am not writing the markup here? So it's really simple. In the form.uname function call, just create a new key value pair called class equal to and write input. And now let's try to reload this source code again, and here you can see class equal to input. So all the key value pairs mentioned to this form field are rendered as HTML attributes. So if I want to add one more attribute, something like style tag, something like that, style equal to color red, and just save it, and again reload this, you can see style equal to color red is added as an additional HTML attribute. So as you keep on giving the key value pairs to this function call, those will be rendered as the HTML attributes in the rendered form input. So using this technique, you can inject HTML attributes and customize the look and feel of your rendered HTML input fields. Alright, this is how simple it is to render forms using WTForms. Just create a form object and declare the form field, and use the form field to render the label and form field input. Alright, now that the rendering is done, how to handle this form inputs? So for that, let's try to create a submit button here. So I'm going to create a new row in this table, copy this and paste it here, and I'm going to go with only one column, and in this column I'm going to write input button here, and I'm going to mention type equal to submit, and I can write the button text here like submit. So now I've saved my template, and let's try to reload this again, and here you can see the submit button. So if I click this submit button, since I have the required field rendered in the HTML, it's asking for the form front-end form validation. So if I write something and click submit, it's saying method not allowed because we did not handle post requests in our server, right? So for that, in the server, let's try to add a method of post also in this root handler. By default, it's only get method, so I'm going to write methods equal to a list of strings, which is going to be get and post. Alright, now we can handle both get and post requests. But when this method is triggered, it can be a get request or a post request. So how can I differentiate whether this method is triggered by a get request or a post request? For that I can use if request dot method equal to post. So this will be true only if this route handler is triggered by a post request. So for now, let's try to print the form object, that's all. So now if I click the submit button, since we are handling the post request also, this function will be triggered, and since the method is post when we click a submit button, because the form method will be submission as a post request, this will be true and the form object will be printed. So let's try to save this and let's try to reload our page and let's try to write something in this and just submit. And here you can see the form object being printed in the console. Alright, let's try to print the form.username form field. So I'm writing form.uname, which is a string field. So let me try to save this server again and reload this and resend the form request. And here you can see I got my form field printed here. But if I want to get the data of the username field, I can just write form.uname.data. So accessing the data attribute of this form.username, which is a form field, I can access the data of this form field. So I'll just save this and reload this and resubmit the data. And here you can see the data of this form field submitted here. So if I just write something like ABCD and just click enter, you can see ABCD being printed. So it is that easy to extract form values using the WTForms form object. Alright, we have just created one form field, right? Let's try to create another form field. So now this time let's try to get the phone number of the user. So let me try to copy paste this line again, and instead of username I'll just write user phone, and this is a string field, the name of it is phone, and validators input required, and let's try to remove this validators length here, and this is going to be a string field by the name user phone. And let's try to save this, and in the template let's try to copy paste this row again, copy and paste, and instead of rendering username I'm going to write user phone. I'm going to render the user phone input also in this line. So now let's save it and let's try to reload the page again. You can see I've got two inputs for name and phone. So it's that simple to create new form fields and manage them using WTForms. But hey, I want my phone number to be a number field instead of a string field. So how can I do that in WTForms? So for that, I'm going to use two things, WTForms.fields and WTForms.widgets. And instead of telling that user phone is a string field, I'm going to write h5 fields dot integer field, and after this validators I'm going to write a widget equal to h5 widgets dot number input. And here I can say the minimum value of the number and the maximum value of the number. So the minimum value is going to be something like 6 and 9 zeros, and the maximum value is going to be something like 10 and 9 zeros. So this is how we can define an integer field using WTForms. Let's try to get the date of birth of the user. So I'm going to copy paste this username again, and here instead of the string field it's going to be a datetime field. So I'm going to write DateTimeField. So it's not a string field now, it's going to be a datetime field, and it's not username, it's going to be user date of birth, and the label of this is going to be date of birth, and the validators is validator.input required. Or else if you don't want to get this input, if you want to make it optional, you can write validators.optional. And one more input which is required to this datetime field is the format, because while form submission it will be a string, WTForms needs to parse it to a datetime field, right? So for that you have to mention this date format string. Standard HTML date format string inputs will be year, month, date. So I have given this format input as year, month, date. So alright, we have defined our date of birth input also. So let's try to save this, and in my template I'm going to write another row here, copy and paste it here, and form.user date of birth, and again I'm going to use the form.user date of birth to render the form date of birth input. So I'm going to save this. Let's reload our form, and here you can see the date of birth input. But in the front end it's not rendered as a HTML date. So let's try to add one more HTML attribute in this user date of birth input, and I'm going to write type equal to date. So this attribute will be added in the HTML of the input field. So let's try to reload this again, and now you can see date of birth is a calendar input, and phone number is a number input because I've used the number field for the phone number. So let's try to input some number, and let's try to type some name, and now let's try to submit the form. The front end form validation is telling that the number should be minimum 6 and 9 zeros. So let's try to add one more zero, and now submit it. You can see the form is submitted, and we got my name printed. So let's try to print other form inputs also. So let's try to copy paste these lines, and here instead of form.username I'm going to write form.user date of birth and form.user phone. Alright, let's try to save it, and let's try to submit this again, and here you can see the name, date of birth and the number are printed. And one more thing you have to note here is that the type of the date of birth object is not a string, actually it's just a date time object. and here the type of this phone is not a string, it's actually a number. So let's try to print the types of those data. So I'm just going to type this type, and here I'm going to show the type of this phone number also, and let's try to save this and try to submit this again. And here you can see it's a datetime object and an integer object. So this is one more huge advantage of using WT forms, that you don't need to parse your form strings and create the native objects. Even though the form input will be given as a string to the server, WT forms will parse that string and convert it to an appropriate date time as defined in the registration form or this WT forms form. Alright, let's try to render a password field for user registration. So I'm going to copy paste this username field again, and I'm going to name it as user password, and this is going to be a password field, right? So I'm going to import the password field from WT forms. Password field, copy this, paste this here. Validators input required because obviously I need this password field, and I'm going to say that the minimum length of the password is 4 and the maximum length is something like 15. Save it, and let's try to render this here. I'm going to create a new row, copy paste this row, and form dot user password, and the same thing, form dot user password, and just remove this. Now we have rendered the user password input field also. So let's try to reload our output now. Alright, the label is still the name because I did not change the label of this form field. Password, the label is password. Let's try to save this and reload this again, and here in the password field I'm getting the password input. Now let's try to render a checkbox using WT forms. That can be done using the BooleanField. So let's try to ask the user whether they want to get promotional emails or not. So let's try to create a field something like, I'm going to copy paste this password, write is get emails, and this is going to be a Boolean field, and I'm going to say the label as get promotional emails, and instead of telling the validators and minimum length, I'm going to say the default value of the Boolean value will be false. That means if user doesn't provide input to this checkbox, the value will be false by default. So let me try to save this and try to render this get promotional emails input. I'm going to copy this row and paste this here, and instead of user password, I'm going to write the form field which is get emails. Copy this and paste this here and paste this here. Let's try to save this and try to run the server again, and here you can see a Boolean field is actually rendered as a checkbox where I can on or off the inputs. Alright, let's try to create another form field where user can say something about himself. So I want to make it a text area field. So how can I render a text area in WT forms? For that you need an additional widget which is wtforms.widgets.textArea. So I'm importing the text area from wtforms.widgets, and I'm going to create another form field called user about me, and it's going to be a string field, and the label is going to be about me, and I'm going to keep it optional. So I'm going to write validators.optional, and I'm going to remove the validators of the length, and here I'm going to say widget equal to text area. Alright, let's try to render the about me form field. So I'm going to just copy this here and paste it here, and form dot user about me, and copy paste this here also. So now user about me is also going to be rendered in the form. I'm just going to save it and reload this. About me text area field is also rendered now. Alright, let's try to take the user gender as a select list in this form. So how can I render a select list or a drop down list in WT forms? So for that you need to import the SelectField from WT forms, and let's try to create another form field called user gender and name the label as gender, and it's going to be a required field. So I'm going to write validators.input required, and I'm going to remove the length validator here. And now for the select field you need to mention an additional input parameter called choices, and this input parameter will be a list of tuples, and each tuple will be the value and text of each option. So I'm going to say 1 comma male, and the next tuple is going to be 2 comma female, and the next tuple is going to be 3 comma other. Alright, I mentioned 3 choices, and each choice is actually a tuple with value and text of the option. So let me try to save this now, and let's try to render the gender input field in the form. So let's try to copy this date of birth field and create another row here, form dot user gender, and copy this, paste it here. I don't need the type here. So that's it. Now I can render the gender select input also. Let's try to save this now and reload our form page. It's telling we got unexpected keyword choices. That's because I have mistakenly mentioned it as string field. I have to mention it as a select field. So I'll just say user gender is a select field. The label is gender, validators is input required, and choices is the select choices. So let's try to save the server now, and let's try to reload the page again. And now you can see the select list is rendered with our choices mentioned in the WT forms, and we did not write a single line of HTML. So let's try to see the page source, how the form is rendered with WT forms. So as you can see, I've just mentioned the form types, and I've just said form dot username, form dot password, and so on, and the whole HTML is being rendered for us for free using WT forms. So this increases the efficiency of our development and reduces manual errors very much. And we can also see front-end validations are applied to the extent possible for simple things, something like required, min, max, and type equal to checkbox, value equal to something, and so on. So that's how you can render various form fields using WT forms. You just create a form object and specify the form input as a form field of this WT forms class, and just call it in the template and it will be rendered for you, and you don't need to write any HTML. Alright, we are done with the rendering. So how do we validate these forms after the post request is received at the server? So it's really simple, and it's just a one-liner. You can just write and form.validate, and that's it. So just by calling the validate method on the form object, WT forms is going to validate each form field, and if there are any errors in the form field, the errors will be populated as strings in the errors object of each form field. So how am I going to display the errors of the form fields? So just below the form input, you can create an unordered list that displays the form errors which are actually populated by the server side using WT forms. So while validating the form.username form input, if there are any errors, WT forms will create a list of errors and populate them in this object attribute called errors. That means if there is any validation error in form.uname, the errors will be present in the form.uname.errors. So let's try to see how form validation works by giving some bad form input. So I'll just remove the type equal to date from this form.dob and try to render the list of errors if they are present in this form validation. So I have to show the errors in form.u date of birth. So let's try to run the server again now, and the date of birth can be given anything, and if I just submit it, I'm going to get some other form inputs also, and let's try to submit it now, and here you can see not a valid date time value. This error is being rendered from WT forms in this attribute called form.userDateOfBirth.errors. So this way WT forms does server side validation and populates the errors into the .errors object of each form field, and those can be used to communicate the error to the users or do further error handling. And also when I submit the form with wrong data inputs, you can see the form data is not printed because in the if condition I am also calling form.validation, and since the form is not validated, I'm not able to see the print statements of the form values. So I'm getting both the benefits of form validation and also communicating the errors of form validation to the user using this .errors attribute. So ideally I have to render all the errors for all form fields, and my HTML template will be bulky. So now I'm going to use the HTML macros to render each form field so that I can reduce template duplication. So here I've created a macro called render input, and it will render each table row for each form field. So here also I'm getting the field errors and showing them as a list. I'm showing the label and I'm showing the field itself. So if you don't know what Flask macros are, I've already created a video on it, and I will leave the link of that video in the description, so you can go through that video to understand what macros in Flask are. So basically macros are just like functions, and you can reduce duplication of code using Flask macros in the Jinja templates. So now instead of rendering each table row, I'll just remove all of this, and I'll just say to render form.username, I'm going to write render input form.uname, and this template will be pasted here. So now I'll render the template for form.userDateOfBirth, form.userPassword. Alright, now using macros, I've reduced my duplication in templates, but it's still the same. I'm rendering each form input and each errors of each form input. Alright, let's try to save it, and let's try to run this again, and let's try to give some form inputs, and let's try to give a valid date of birth and just submit here. And since the form is validated, I've got my inputs printed. Let's try to remove this type equal to date and render the form so that I can enter invalid date here. And let's try to provide some form inputs and submit. Now you can see not a valid date time value. So if you want to style the errors here, I've given this unordered list of errors a class called errors, and I can create a style tag here and style these errors. So using the style tags, I'm telling that the unordered list with class errors will have font size of 0.5 em, that means half of the font size, and color will be red. So let me try to save this template and again reload the output. and here you can see the error is styled now. Alright, now we have covered how to define form fields, how to render the form fields in HTML, and how to get the data of the form fields using this form.formField.data, and how to validate the form fields. Now if I want to perform some custom validation on each form field, how can I do that? Suppose I want my username to start with only alphabets. That validation is not present by default in WTForms. So how can I do that validation? Well, once your form is validated with some basic validations, you can perform your custom validations inside the route handler itself. So once the form is validated, if I want to check if the username is starting with the alphabet, I can just write if form.username.0 is alpha. That means the first character of the form username is not an alphabet. Then I can actually populate errors into the form object field. So I'm going to write form.username.errors.append. So I'm adding a new string to this errors list, and the string will be username will start with an alphabet. So once the basic validation of WTForms or the inbuilt validation of the WTForms is over, I'm performing my customized form validation, and if I get errors, I'm actually handling them by adding errors into the WTForms object. So let's try to save this now and open the output and reload it and give some values. And now let's try to begin the name with a number so that my form validation fails. And if I just click submit, StringField object is not subscriptable. I got an error because form.username.0 is not correct. Form.username.data.0, because the data will be present in the .data attribute. So just save it, and I'm going to run this again and just start the name with some non-alphabetical character and submit. And now you got username should start with an alphabet. This validation is not done by WTForms, it's actually done by us, and we have injected errors into the form object. So this way you can do custom form validation, which is really powerful. So now using this custom form validation concept, you can get obvious form validation for free, and you can do your own customized form validation also. So that's it, guys. That's how you can create forms using WTForms and manage your forms effectively using WTForms. You can see I've created a blog post on managing forms in Flask with WTForms. I've also given you the detailed explanations, source code and templates so that you can practice it in your own computer. So be sure to check out the link of this blog post in the description of this video. I've also given you references to the official documentation. For example, I've given you the reference to the WTForms documentation. Please provide your valuable feedback or ask any doubts in the comment section. Hope you like this video, guys. Thank you for watching. Peace.